Long before fiberglass bats, foam boards, or reflective liners, medieval households learned how to keep heat alive long after the fire died. In stone cottages, timber halls, and rural workshops, warmth was not something you turned on. It was something you managed, guarded, and preserved. Fuel was precious. Winters were long, and a fire that burned all night was often impossible. Yet historical records and archaeological evidence show that medieval people routinely woke to warm embers, unfrozen rooms, and usable heat by morning. One of the most effective and least understood reasons was ash. Not ash as waste, but ash as insulation. This was not folklore or superstition. It was applied knowledge built on observation, repetition, and necessity. Why medieval people treated ash as a resource rather than refuse. In a medieval household, nothing that came from fire was discarded without purpose. Ash was collected daily and stored carefully. Ash, you know, was actually used for all sorts of things back in the day: soap making, food preservation, soil improvement, pest control, and perhaps most importantly, heat management. Wood ash, especially from hardwoods, is, well, light and dry, and it's filled with these tiny microscopic air pockets. Folks in medieval times noticed that when they buried hot coals in ash, those coals cooled down slowly instead of right away. So this little observation turned into a regular practice over time. People figured out just how ash worked as a really effective thermal insulator. Basically, ash does the trick because it traps air, and that trapped air helps keep the heat in. You see, heat moves really slowly through still air, and ash, well, it's made up of these fine little particles that actually stop air from circulating. When embers were covered in a thick layer of ash, oxygen was seriously limited, and as a result, heat loss was reduced quite a bit. The embers didn't exactly burst into flame, but they stayed hot, you know. In a properly managed hearth, this meant that fires could be brought back to life, even hours later, with very little effort. Now, here's the thing. Hearth design was absolutely critical to making ash insulation work. Medieval hearths weren't just open pits by accident. They were shallow, wide, and quite often lined with stone or clay, making the whole system much more effective. This shape allowed ash to be spread evenly over coals. At night, the fire was allowed to burn down naturally. Once the flames disappeared, the glowing embers were levelled and buried beneath several centimetres of ash. The hearth opening was sometimes partially blocked with a wooden or stone screen to reduce airflow. By morning, the embers were still alive beneath the ash, ready to be stirred and fed with fresh fuel. How this practice extended beyond fireplaces into food and shelter. Ash insulation was not limited to hearths. Hot stones were buried in ash and placed under bedding to warm sleeping platforms. Clay pots filled with embers and ash were used as foot warmers. In some regions, walls and floors were packed with ash mixed with clay to improve insulation. Why did ash outperform soil and sand in heat retention? Well, soil contains moisture, which, you know, pulls heat away rapidly. And sand It conducts heat more efficiently than ash. Ash, by contrast, remains dry and porous. Medieval builders and households recognized this difference through experience. Ash layers were kept dry and protected from rain. Well, wet ash lost its insulating value, so, storage and handling really mattered. This attention to detail honestly separated effective heat retention from failure. So, how can this knowledge be applied safely today? The medieval ash insulator is still relevant, especially in outdoor settings and emergency situations. After a controlled fire has burned down, embers can be safely buried under clean, dry wood ash to preserve heat for hours. This method, can be used to keep coals alive overnight when fuel is scarce. Ash can also be used to insulate hot containers, stones, or cookware to retain warmth. So, the key steps are making sure the ash is, fully dry, applying it thickly enough to actually block airflow, and, managing the placement to avoid any accidental ignition. Modern users must also respect fire safety and local regulations, but the principle, it really does remain sound. Why did this method matter in a world without constant fuel access? Well, firewood required a fair bit of labour. Cutting, hauling and drying wood all consumed time and energy, you see. By preserving heat overnight, medieval households reduced fuel consumption significantly. One well-managed fire, honestly, could last for days. This efficiency mattered most during those harsh winters, when daylight was short and, energy reserves were low. Ash insulation was not a convenience. It was, in fact, a survival strategy. So, what does archaeological evidence tell us about this practice? Excavations of medieval hearths frequently reveal thick ash layers with preserved charcoal beneath. These are not accidental accumulations. They show repeated, deliberate use. Some hearths contain ash deposits far thicker than would result from, careless cleaning. This pattern appears across regions and centuries, indicating shared knowledge rather than just isolated habit. Why, you might wonder, has modern heating culture forgotten this lesson? Well, modern heating systems, they sort of remove the need to think about heat behaviour at all. When warmth becomes automatic, you see, understanding just sort of fades away. Medieval people, on the other hand, they simply could not afford ignorance. They studied how materials behaved really closely because, their comfort and even their survival depended on it. Ash insulation, it actually represents a broader principle. Waste from one process can become the solution to another. What this medieval technique teaches about backyard wisdom is, pretty straightforward, really. True backyard wisdom is not about novelty. It is about understanding fundamentals. Heat moves, air insulates, moisture steals warmth. Medieval people learned these truths without textbooks or instruments. They learned by paying attention. The ash insulator is a reminder that simple materials used intelligently can outperform complex systems when conditions are harsh. If you value practical history that still applies to everyday resilience, subscribe to Backyard Wisdom and share this episode with others who believe the past still offers reliable solutions. Knowledge that kept people warm centuries ago still deserves a place in the present.